Good day, students. Welcome to the first of a couple of lectures on potato health. These first two lectures are going to be discussing the role of quarantine and certification systems in ensuring potato health. The second one will follow on, and then the last lecture in the series will be potato diseases. I'm Jackie van der Wals from the Department of Plant and Soil Sciences, and I'm sure most of you know me already. So firstly, let's just have a look at some plant diseases and how they've moved around the world as a background to why certification is important and quarantine is important. So if we just take a couple of these examples, the most important ones are potato late blight, which we'll be focusing on a bit later, yellow wheat rust, very important, chestnut blight, different kind of yellow rust on wheat, coffee leaf rust, wheat stem rust again. Most of these I've discussed with you previously, so you'll be aware of them. You can actually put this into the current context of COVID that we're dealing with now. So, dealing with plant diseases, we are going to have a look at how quarantine and certification plays a role in the health of potatoes globally. This is one of my favorite quotes, and I'm sure I've shown it to you previously. It's by A.A. Milne, and he said, if a fellow really likes potatoes, he must be a pretty decent sort of fellow, which is why I like potatoes. If you don't know who A.A. Milne is, I suggest you go and read Winnie the Pooh. I'll leave it at that. So let's start by looking at the potato migration map. Potatoes, as you know, hopefully you know, came from the Andes, and from there they were spread by the conquistadors into Europe in the late 1500s, and then further into Europe a bit further down. Then from there they went back to Northern America. They also went in the 1600s to India, Japan and China. From Europe they went to Africa, and they went to what we call the New World. So as you can see, potatoes have basically spread all around the world. And when you spread a plant or a propagative part of a plant, one essentially spreads pathogens with it if one is not careful. So why potatoes? Well, most of us really enjoy potatoes. This is the most common form, but if you're not inclined to eat potato chips, some of you might like it in a different kind of form. But however you like your potatoes, they are very important. They are the fourth staple food crop in the world after maize, wheat and rice. Hopefully you know what this picture refers to, these pictures. If you know the history of plant pathology, if you know anything about potatoes, and if you were listening a few slides back, you will know that this refers to late blight of potatoes, caused by Phytophthora infestans, one of the most well-studied plant pathogens. So late blight in Ireland resulted in the death of approximately 1 million Irish people and the immigration of another 2 million people. These are just some of the symptoms of potato late blight. So this is a susceptible variety and some tolerant varieties here. So as you can see, it's a highly destructive disease. This is just one example of where no quarantine, no certification was in place. This was long before scientists knew anything about certification or plant pathogens. So plant quarantine, if we look at a definition of plant quarantine, is essentially the enforcement of regulations that are aimed at preventing the introduction of harmful plants, which are weeds, pests and or pathogens, into new areas. And if they are already introduced into those areas, to prevent the further spread and establishment of the pathogens in those areas. That's in a nutshell what plant quarantine is. So what kind of spread are we talking about when we refer to the spread of, in this case, plant pathogens? Well, firstly, we can have international spread. So I've shown you how the potato is spread around the world. But what about spread of pathogens? So when potatoes are moved from one country to another, we are often inadvertently spreading pathogens with it, and this would be international spread. So for example, from Europe to South Africa. But there's another kind of spread we need to bear in mind. Sorry, let's just go back. This is where plant quarantine and phytosanitary regulations are very important to stop the international spread of plant pathogens. So the second kind of spread would be national spread. So, for example, where a pathogen present in one growing region, for example, Limpopo, and it's spread to another growing region, for example, the Western Free State, this would be national spread. So if the pathogen was only contained in Limpopo, or only present in Limpopo, we would want to contain it there, much like what's happening in the epidemic right now, the COVID epidemic. Another kind of spread is regional spread, so within one region. So, for example, if the pathogen were present on one farm in a region, and only on that farm, we would want to contain it on that farm to prevent regional spread. So again, this is where plant quarantine and phytosanitary regulations come in to stop national and regional spread of pathogens. Seed certification schemes also play a role in limiting or stopping national and regional spread of pathogens. However, the main aim of certification is to ensure that seed potatoes meet the standards of the specific certification agency. Most of the time it's a national agency. It's not a guarantee that seeds are disease-free. Let me just pause there for a moment. When I talk about potatoes and I'm talking about seeds, I'm talking about seed tubers. So the propagation material of a potato is a seed tuber. Okay, so a seed certification scheme doesn't guarantee that the tubers that are planted for propagation are disease-free. What it does say is that they meet the maximum allowable pest and disease thresholds for each seed generation. So quality seed potatoes or seed tubers are the key to sustainability and productivity of the potato industry globally. If we do not have certification in place, we will end up seeing seed degeneration. There is most certainly a positive correlation between yield in terms of potatoes and country income, but also a positive correlation between effective enforcement of quarantine and certification systems. So what do I mean by this? If we have a look at this world map, and I've just grouped it into different colors, or it has been grouped into different colors in terms of high income in blue, down to low income in orange and red. And we have a look at the yields, we will see that most often the potato yields are correlated with the country income. And this is also linked to effective enforcement of quarantine and certification systems. Zooming into Africa, these are stats from 2016 from the FAO. 47%, that's almost half of the African potato countries had yields of less than 10 tons per hectare. Now, to give you some background about potato production, when one plants a hectare of potatoes, one normally plants between 3 and 5 tons of seed tubers per hectare. So if the yields are only around 10 tons, that is certainly not economically viable. In South Africa, for example, we have yields of around 47 to 50 tons per hectare, which is very high even by a global standard. So let's have a look at the top potato producing countries in Africa in 2016 and what their yields were in tons per hectare. The lowest was Egypt in 27 tons per hectare. Then we had Morocco and Niger, 29, Algeria 31, and South Africa 43. That's an average tons per hectare. So you can see that these top potato producing countries also have relatively high yields compared to the rest of Africa. But what we also note is that these countries with high yields are on the most prominent trade routes. So quarantine is paramount to the industry's survival. What has happened in these countries is that plant quarantine has been enforced for many, many years to ensure the survival of the industry. And this is why the yields are essentially higher. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a couple of quarantine and certification success stories, just a few, and then I will have a look at the flip side of that coin. So the first success story is that of potato spindle tuber viroid, also known as PSTVD globally. Now what PSTVD does is it creates much smaller tubers than the regular size. The second one is Ralstonia solanacearum in South Africa. These are the symptoms of a tuber infected with Ralstonia. And then Dickia solani in Scotland. So PSTVD globally. PSTVD was first reported on potatoes in the US about 1 century ago. And after that, there were a number of other disease reports from Asia, Africa, Australia, Canada, inter alia, many other countries. So basically where you see these stars. So it spread rapidly throughout the world. There was then a global effort to eradicate or reduce PSTVD in potato production. So many countries put in emergency measures in place to reduce the incidence in potato and tomato, which is an alternative host of this viroid. And these quarantine and certification programs have played a significant role in the eradication or reduction of the disease. So if we look now at the world map and where the pathogen is currently present and where it has been eradicated, we see that in the countries with the green stars, Argentina, Canada, Finland, France, South Africa included, the disease has essentially been eradicated completely due predominantly to very, very strict certification and quarantine measures. There's currently restricted distribution of the pathogen in a few countries throughout the world. One very good success story of quarantine and certification. Some of the challenges with PSTVD, however, are firstly that this pathogen, this viroid, has a very wide host range. So even though it has been eradicated from potatoes, it's possibly still present in other hosts and can spread to potatoes. The other problem is that we see symptomless infections in other plants, especially in some of the solanaceous ornamentals, which are present in gardens, for example. Then there are also multiple transmission routes, including true potato seed and potato germplasm. Now, germplasm is what is normally used to transport or to export supposedly pathogen-free seed or germplasm, to other countries. However, this pathogen is often present in germplasm. Another problem is that the infection rates and the viroid concentrations in seed lots vary and may be very, very low, thereby making it possible to miss the pathogen. So qPCR is preferable for testing, but this is of course very expensive. And often the sample sizes tested are too small to actually detect the viroid. Next is bacterial wilt, caused by obviously the bacterium Ralstonia solanacearum, and this causes a very serious yield limiting disease in many developing countries. It's also known as bacterial wilt or green wilt. The pathogen is seed-borne, soil-borne, waterborne. It's also found in volunteers and weeds. Seed certification schemes are imperative because of the fact that it is seed-borne. Once it's present in the soil or in water, it's almost impossible to eradicate. So we have a success story from home. In South Africa, between 1914 and 1970, there were 4 recorded incidences of bacterial wilt. This is probably due to the fact that the testing for this pathogen was not optimized in that period. After 1970, the number of confirmed cases began to rise sharply. And in the 1990s, several research projects were launched to study this pathogen and the epidemiology thereof. Based on the results from some of these research projects, in 1995, the Potato Certification Service was established in South Africa. Based on this, all registered seed potato plantings had to be tested by ELISA through the establishment of the Potato Certification Service. And the success is that Ralstonia is now a quarantine pathogen in the seed potato industry. So if we just have a look at the decrease in number of bacterial wilt incidences in seed lots from 1994 down to 2018, where it's basically been eradicated, this is most certainly a very good success story. The next success story that I want to talk about is Dickia solani in Scotland. Now, Dickia solani is another pathogen that causes black leg and stem rot in potatoes. The first reports of this very aggressive pathogen were in table potatoes in Scotland in 2009 and 10. And the Scottish seed industry instituted compulsory testing of all seed lots that were due to be planted in Scotland for Dickia species. Currently, the only places where compulsory testing for Dickia and Pectobacterium are instituted is in Scotland and Northern Ireland. It's not done in Europe. So the sampling size and the sampling strategy are critical, and they're incorporated into the sampling regimes for Ralstonia and for Clavibacter michiganensis, which is another destructive bacterium. And since the sampling and testing for Pectobacterium and Dickia has been instituted, there have been no new outbreaks of Dickia solani in Scottish seed, which is really fantastic. So here you can see since 2010 up until 2015, no new outbreaks. And the latest reports also say that no new outbreaks of blackleg caused by Dickia solani have been reported in Scotland.